Last Monday, it looked like Donald Trump, after his tweet on Easter that he was going to end the civilization of Iran, and I mentioned before he meant the regime, the theocracy, the civilization of radical Shia jihadism in Iran, they wanted to impeach him. They said he was a warmonger, a Hitlerian figure. The next day, he announced that negotiations would take place, and then he was a taco, a Neville Chamberlain, a George McGovern, a Jimmy Carter. Trump always chickens out. But it's indicative that they don't look at the war empirically. They look at it entirely in political terms.
One day he's Hitler, the next day he's Neville Chamberlain. The same war, the same week, the same commentators, just flipping the verdict based on whatever the last 24 hours produced. That whiplash isn't analysis, it's a tell. It tells you the people doing it have already decided what they want the conclusion to be, and they're working backwards from there. This video is about what happens when you stop doing that and actually look at the longer picture.
In fact, people as diverse as Tom Friedman or Bill Kristol, if you collate what they have written, they almost feel that anything that happens negatively in Iran might be positive because it would hurt Donald Trump, and then therefore that would be in the long-term interest, forgetting that we have 100,000 soldiers in the theater risking their lives, and they're risking their lives to eliminate the real opportunity, the real likelihood that Iran could get nuclear-tipped missiles very quickly, not just aimed at Western Europe, but in 2 or 3 years, perhaps the United States as well, given the participation of North Korea, China, and Russia in their arms industry and their agenda. So we have to look at the long version. And the long version is the only way we can do that is look at history. And history says it's very unusual that one side has been so victorious in an asymmetric war, especially against the strongest power in the Middle East by all accounts. 93 million people, a huge territory, and people were terrified of it. Not just the Gulf monarchies, but the Europeans. They de facto, we say the strait was open before the war. Yeah, it was open, but it was open on the conditions that Iran would close it any minute or could make things difficult. Prior to this closing, it had closed it in 1980, 79 and 80, and again in 2019, and it threatened to do it on many occasions. It's not going to be able to do that when this war. So if you look at it realistically, very quickly, they don't have a military, so to speak. They have lost probably hundreds of billions, if not $500 billion in a half-century investment in missiles, in drones, and sophisticated aircraft, in submarines, in capital ships. Their command and control is down to the second and third tier, and no one knows who's in power. We don't know if it's the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. We don't know if it's the political class. We don't know if it's the theocracy. We don't know if it's the army. But we know two things, that they are each afraid of each other. They don't want to seem as if they're too compliant, so they want to be as hardline as possible.
Let's start with the most important claim in that segment, because it's the kind of thing that would be dismissed as paranoid if it weren't so clearly documented. The argument is that prominent commentators on the left have reached a point where American failure in Iran would be, in their framework, a net positive because it damages Trump. That's not a fringe accusation, it's a logical inference from the public record. When the same writer calls a president a warmonger on Monday and a coward on Tuesday for the same decision about the same war, the variable being tracked is not military effectiveness, it's political positioning. And when the political positioning is consistently oriented toward the outcome that hurts the sitting president most, you've crossed from criticism into something else. Something that involves 100,000 American service members in a live theater being treated as props in a domestic political calculation. That is worth saying out loud, because the stakes of getting this wrong analytically, not politically, are significant. Iran was not a manageable adversary in slow decline. It was an accelerating threat. North Korean missile technology, Chinese industrial support, Russian weapons transfers, a nuclear timeline that had compressed from a decade to potentially 2 or 3 years. The people now performing outrage theater over every setback were not, in the preceding years, proposing credible alternatives to stopping that trajectory. They were not offering plans. They were offering resistance to any plan that came from this administration, dressed up in the language of principled opposition. Now to the military picture, the long view the transcript insists on taking. Iran, at the start of this conflict, was the most formidable military power in the Middle East by conventional measure. 93 million people, decades of investment in asymmetric capabilities, ballistic missiles, drones, submarine warfare, sophisticated air defense. The Gulf monarchies were terrified of it. European governments quietly deferred to it. The Strait of Hormuz functioned as an Iranian instrument of leverage over the global economy, even when it was technically open, because everyone knew it could be closed, and had been before. That leverage is gone. The command and control structure has been struck down to the second and third tier. No one inside Iran currently knows with certainty who holds authority. Not the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, not the political class, not the theocracy, not the conventional army. And critically, those factions are now afraid of each other as much as they are afraid of external pressure. The hardline posturing coming out of Tehran right now may be almost entirely performative internal signaling by factions trying not to be the one that looks weak when the accounting comes. The reason none of them can simply cut a deal is also clarifying. Any faction that negotiates a settlement and then loses power in a transitional period faces the prospect of being held accountable for 47 years of what that government has done to its own people and to others. That's not paranoia. That's rational calculation from people who have watched what happened to figures in comparable situations elsewhere in the region. The paralysis at the top of the Iranian government is not a mystery. It is the predictable result of a leadership class that has run out of good options and knows it. The media's 24-hour cycle cannot process this. It requires a framework built on daily verdicts, success, failure, escalation, collapse applied to a campaign that is operating on a strategic timeline measured in weeks and months. Every day that doesn't produce a clean resolution gets coded as drift or failure. Every negotiation signal gets coded as weakness. Every military development that isn't immediately decisive gets coded as stalemate. None of those codes are accurate. They are the product of applying the wrong analytical lens to a situation that requires a longer one. The historical point matters here. Asymmetric wars against militarily superior opponents, where one side has overwhelming air and technological dominance, almost never end quickly in the conventional sense. What they produce is the systematic degradation of the opponent's capacity to resist, fight, or credibly threaten. That's what the transcript describes as already having happened. $500 billion in military investment, accumulated over half a century, has been rendered largely inert in a matter of weeks. That is not a stalemate. That is a decisive shift in the regional power balance, and it happened on terms that avoided the catastrophic errors of Iraq and Afghanistan, where ground occupation turned military victory into political quicksand. The longer view, held consistently, produces a very different picture than the one the 24-hour cycle is broadcasting.
Take Russia. Russia has no presence in Venezuela now. It has no presence in Latin America. It has no presence in the Middle East. Its Assad regime is gone. It had a drone back and forth relationship with Iran. Maybe it's supplying some weaponry across the Caspian Sea we don't know about. But for all practical purposes, that's been severed. It's bogged down in a war with Ukraine. It's lost over 1.5 million people. It enjoys a little spike in the oil prices, and that may help it, but it would be much more likely that they would want to now get out of the Ukrainian war, have some kind of deal, armistice, and then have sanctions lifted off them because they feel that maybe the Strait of Hormuz doesn't have a good future, which turns us to the Gulf itself. The Strait of Hormuz has 20%, not 80%, 20% of the world's oil going through it every day. The Saudis are going to expand their Red Sea pipeline. The Emirates are going to expand their pipelines that serve other countries that are oil producers in the Gulf of Oman. They're talking about going across the desert through Jordan to Haifa. And you could envision in 4 or 5 years the Gulf might only serve Iran. Instead of being an asset, it could be a liability. If anybody wanted to close it, it would hurt, Iraq and Iran more than anybody else. I mean, Iran has other ports, but it would be an inert asset. And so holding on to the strait and threatening the world means that people are going to find alternative oil supplies. And they're already doing it with the U.S. and Venezuela. And if Russia is smart, it will try to find a ceasefire and join in this alternate supply that's non-Gulf. China has been hurt because it got 80% of all Iranian oil, and that'll be contingent on the United States. It's already contingent whether they get Venezuelan oil on the United States. It won't be sold to them at a discount. They look at the war, and what do they say? What do they see? They see that drones, submarine drones, surface craft drones, aircraft drones, and now the United States has broadcast to the world they're going to acquire, 500,000, 1 million of them. They're late to the party, but when we get riled up and we get activated, we can outproduce almost anybody. And the idea that they're going to go across 110 nautical miles into Taiwan after what they've seen in Iran would be very foolhardy. The United States fleet could sit on the other side of Taiwan, arm Taiwan to the teeth, which they're doing now, and it would be very hard for hundreds of, if not thousands of Chinese shipping to come across that strait without being under a constant fire from a sea of ballistic missiles and drones. Europe is a big loser. We didn't ask all that much of them. We just said supply us by letting us use your bases and your airspace. That was a very modest. They wouldn't do that. The Spanish closed their embassy in Israel, and they kept it open in Iran. For all practical purposes, Spain is a belligerent. France wouldn't let us use its air power. They won't even go into Lebanon, their special post-colonial friend and responsibility, and help get rid of Hezbollah. Britain said they were going to go protect their interest in Cyprus. They have a base that was targeted. They can't even send one destroyer there. Turkey is a NATO member, and what has Turkey been doing? It's been really siding with Iran, and it's threatened to invade and attack Israel, a NATO partner. That's our other NATO partner. Italy, we thought, was a close conservative friend. They wouldn't let bombers land in Sicily. The UK has been the most disappointing. Maybe it'll try to help. It doesn't have much resources anymore. It's sad to say, given the history of the Royal Navy. But my gosh, if we were to say, if we had said to Margaret Thatcher when she asked our aid in 1982 to help in the Falklands, we could have just quoted what Stumer would later say. This is not our war. It's not our war. It's not our war in Serbia. It's not our war in Libya. It's not our war in Chad. So you can see the problem with NATO in name only, and it will be a bilateral. It'll be a bilateral alliance, I think, more and more, that the United States will pick and choose which NATO members that it will fully work with, because the rest are either neutral or hostile to the United States. And finally, the United States, if this war ends in 2 or 3 weeks, it'll still be 7 months for the economy to recover, and the oil will start flowing out of the Gulf, and more importantly, Venezuelan oil, American oil, and even perhaps Russian oil will get on the market to capture these high prices, and people will avoid the Gulf as much as they can, and the Gulf will be opened one way or the other. And so there's a good chance that the economy can return, and there's a better chance that people will come to the realization after this 24-hour hysteria and media cycle and left-wing fanaticism is over. When they look at the situations empirically, they're going to say, my gosh, Iran is not threatening the Middle East. My gosh, they don't have a ballistic missile threat. They do not have an immediate avenue to get nuclear weapons. They have no military. Their entire command and control has been wiped out. Their population is furious. It's stewing. This could be like the fall of the Berlin Wall, which not the next day, not the next week, not the next month, but within months, or in the case of the Soviet Union, within 2 years, you could see a regime change. So the United States is in a good position, especially because we chose not to fight on the conditions that we did in Iraq and Afghanistan, where we're fighting house to house in Taji or Fallujah, or we don't know who's friend, who's enemy in a village in Afghanistan. Now, this was fought on Western American terms, and the asymmetry shows it. So we don't know what the ultimate prognosis of this war is, but if we take the long view, it's far more favorable to our interests than it is our enemies.
The geopolitical ripple effects laid out in that segment are the part of this story that almost no one in the daily coverage is tracking, and they may end up being more consequential than anything that happened in Iranian airspace. Start with Russia. The Assad regime is gone. Russian presence in the Middle East has effectively collapsed. Its proxy relationship with Iran, drones, weapons transfers, mutual deterrence, has been severed or severely degraded. It is fighting an exhausting war in Ukraine with over 1.5 million casualties. Its leverage over global energy markets was always partly a function of Middle Eastern instability. That instability is now being resolved in a direction that is not favorable to Moscow. The rational move for Russia, as the transcript notes, is to find an exit from Ukraine, seek sanctions relief, and reposition toward the alternative energy market that is emerging: American, Venezuelan, and non-Gulf supply. The war in Iran has materially changed Russia's strategic calculus in ways that extend far beyond the Middle East. China watched something in this campaign that no intelligence briefing could have communicated as clearly. Drones, submarine, surface, and aerial deployed at scale, with precision, in a contested environment. And the United States announcing it intends to acquire them by the hundreds of thousands. Any serious Chinese military planner looking at 110 nautical miles of the Taiwan Strait after watching what happened to Iranian air defense and command infrastructure has to revise their assumptions. Taiwan is being armed. The American fleet can position on the far side. The drone density required to suppress a crossing fleet is now a demonstrated capability, not a theoretical one. The deterrence value of this campaign for Taiwan may be its most underreported strategic dividend. Europe is the clear loser, not because it was attacked, but because it revealed itself. Spain closed its embassy in Israel and kept it open in Iran. France refused airspace. Italy refused Sicily. Turkey, a NATO member, was functionally siding with Iran and threatening Israel. Britain, with its history and its bases, couldn't send a single destroyer to protect its own interests in Cyprus. These are not minor diplomatic disagreements. They are a documented record of which European governments could be counted on when it mattered, and which ones couldn't. That record now exists, and will shape American bilateral calculations for years. The Berlin Wall comparison at the end of the segment is the one to sit with. The wall didn't fall the day after Reagan said tear it down. The Soviet Union didn't collapse the week Gorbachev announced glasnost. These things move on their own timelines, driven by internal pressures that accumulate until the structure can no longer hold. Iran's population is furious. Its command structure is fractured. Its military capacity has been broken. Its funding pipelines to regional proxies have been cut. The conditions for internal collapse are being assembled, not through occupation, not through regime change military objectives, but through the systematic removal of every pillar that kept the current government in power. That's the long view. And the long view says, this is working.